They thought they were burying her alive. Every morning at precisely 5:15 a.m., the ground beneath Margaret's floorboards didn't just shake, it groaned. It was a deep, metallic rumble that started in the bowels of the mega factory on the ridge and rolled down the valley like an oncoming storm. Then came the sound that had defined the last 13 years of her existence. The heavy, pressurized hiss of industrial hydraulic beds tilting upward. And finally, the roar. A cascading, suffocating avalanche of yellow-white sawdust, pouring over the rusted barbed wire fence, swallowing her late husband's oak trees, and choking the life out of the soil. The air would turn into a thick, blinding fog of pulverized timber, settling in Margaret's hair, coating the windows of her kitchen, and stinging the eyes of the last few farm animals she had left. To the suits at Oakridge Timber Corp, she wasn't a person. She was a geographic inconvenience. An 82-year-old widow, living alone on 40 acres of rapidly dying land, wedged right in the path of their multi-million-dollar expansion line. They didn't want to buy her out at a fair price. They wanted to break her. They wanted her to pack her bags, abandon the house her husband Thomas had built with his own two hands, and quietly disappear into a state-run nursing home. And so, they chose the path of legal, bureaucratic warfare disguised as industrial waste management. They claimed a property dispute boundary allowed them to utilize the low-lying basin of her north pasture as a secondary runoff site. For 13 years, the local courts, greased by corporate donations, dragged their feet. For 13 years, the trucks kept backing up to the fence line. If you walked into the local diner in the small town of Blackwood, the locals would speak about Margaret in hushed, pitying tones. They called her poor old Margaret. They watched her walking down the gravel road with her faded canvas market bag, her shoulders slightly hunched, her hands calloused and stained a perpetual, deep earthen brown. Why doesn't she just sign the papers? They would whisper over their coffee. She's fighting a ghost. That factory owns the town. She's letting them kill her farm. From the outside, it certainly looked that way. The vibrant clover pastures that Thomas had cultivated were completely gone, replaced by massive, shifting dunes of dry, sterile sawdust that stretched as far as the eye could see. When the wind blew from the north, the dust storms were so intense they blocked out the afternoon sun, turning her world into a bleak, monotone wasteland of dead wood. But what the corporate executives at Oakridge Timber didn't understand, what they failed to calculate in their high-rise boardrooms, was who Margaret actually was before she became a widow. They saw an old woman in an oversized cardigan and muddy boots. They didn't see the woman who, 40 years prior, held a master's degree in agricultural biochemistry from one of the finest institutions in the country. They didn't see the woman who had spent her youth researching microbial soil regeneration before returning to live a quiet life of peace with the love of her life. They thought they were dumping garbage on a helpless victim. They had absolutely no idea that they were delivering millions of dollars of raw carbon material directly to a master chemist. Every single night, long after the factory gates had closed and the heavy machinery had fallen silent, a single lantern would flicker to life in the window of Margaret's dilapidated barn. While the town slept, and while the factory executives toasted to their projected quarterly profits, the widow was at work. She didn't cry. She didn't curse the sky. Instead, she would step out into the dark, carrying a heavy iron spade and buckets filled with strange, pungent mixtures she had brewed in her basement. To the untrained eye, it looked like the mad, desperate, erratic movements of a broken mind. She was digging deep into the sawdust dunes, turning the dry particles over, blending them with secret layers of organic matter, animal manure she traded for in secret from distant counties, and specific strains of nitrogen-fixing bacteria she cultivated in glass jars on her kitchen counter. It was a grueling, exhausting physical labor that should have broken a woman half her age. Her joints ached in the damp autumn air, and her lungs burned from the lingering dust. But every time her spade struck the earth, she remembered the promise she made to Thomas before he closed his eyes for the last time. Don't let them take the dirt, Maggie. The dirt is where we lived. She wasn't just surviving. She was executing a clinical, highly scientific operation. Raw sawdust is notoriously hostile to life. It is incredibly high in carbon, and if left alone, it completely starves the surrounding soil of nitrogen, rendering it a sterile desert where nothing can grow for decades. The factory thought they were poisoning her land permanently. They believed that by piling thousands of tons of wood waste onto her property, they were creating an environmental dead zone that would eventually force the county health department to condemn the property. They truly believed they had won the war of attrition. They didn't realize that Margaret was playing a game of time, and 13 years was exactly how long she needed. The turning point began silently, right beneath the surface. During the winter of the 12th year, the corporate headquarters of Oakridge Timber Corp had just undergone a massive merger, absorbing a multinational logistics conglomerate. The new CEO, a ruthless, sharp-featured man named Richard Vance, was not a man who tolerated loose ends. During his very first week, he flew down in a private helicopter to inspect the Blackwood facility. Standing on the elevated steel catwalk of the main processing plant, he looked down at the sprawling, ugly mountain of sawdust that had accumulated on the widow's property. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the small, stubborn farmhouse standing right at the edge of the gray, dusty desert. "Why is that shack still standing?" Vance asked the plant manager, his voice dripping with icy impatience. The manager shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his hard hat. "That's the Miller property, sir." The old woman, Margaret. "We've been dumping the primary softwood residue back there for over a decade to pressure her out. The lawyers say the title dispute is still technically active, but she's 82. We figured nature would take its course by now." Vance spat over the railing. "I don't leave my expansion timelines up to nature. We need that valley floor cleared and paved for our new automated distribution center by next spring. Offer her $50,000. If she refuses, file an emergency environmental hazard injunction. Tell the county her property is an unmanaged fire risk due to the sawdust accumulation. Force her off through the sheriff's department. I want her gone in 90 days. The next afternoon, a sleek, black luxury SUV rolled down Margaret's long, unpaved driveway, kicking up clouds of fine white wood dust. Two young lawyers in pristine, tailored suits stepped out, holding leather briefcases. They held handkerchiefs over their noses to block out the dry air as they approached the front porch. Margaret was sitting in an old wicker rocking chair, quietly knitting a wool blanket. She didn't stand up when they approached. She didn't even look up from her needles. "Mrs. Miller," the lead lawyer said, his voice carrying that practiced, condescending warmth used by people who think they are speaking to a child. "We represent Oakridge Timber. We are here to offer you a very generous, final settlement for your property. $50,000, cash, and we will cover your relocation fees to a beautiful assisted living facility in the city. If you don't accept today, we will be moving forward with an environmental lawsuit tomorrow. The county will declare this land a hazardous waste zone due to the millions of gallons of unmanaged sawdust. You'll lose the farm anyway, and you'll leave with nothing. Sign here, and this can all be over." He extended a gold pen toward her. Margaret stopped knitting. She slowly lowered the needles into her lap and raised her eyes. They were not the dull, defeated eyes of an elderly victim. They were sharp, piercing, and shockingly bright. A slow, deeply unsettling smile spread across her wrinkled face. It wasn't a smile of resignation. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster who had just seen her opponent fall directly into a trap they spent 13 years setting. $50,000? Margaret asked, her voice steady and clear, completely devoid of the frailty they expected. That is a very specific number. But tell me, young man, did Mr. Vance actually look at the land before he sent you here with that pen? The lawyers exchanged a confused, impatient glance. Mrs. Miller, we aren't here to discuss geography. Look out there. Your farm is a graveyard of sawdust. It's worthless. You have 24 hours to sign. Margaret calmly stood up, leaning slightly on her cane, and walked to the edge of the porch. She pointed toward the massive, rolling hills of what used to be white, barren sawdust. Go back to your office and tell Richard Vance that I decline, she said softly. And tell him that if he wants my land, he's going to have to come down here himself. But tell him to bring his boots, because the ground is changing. The lawyers scoffed, slamming their briefcases shut, and walked back to their vehicle, muttering about how the old woman had clearly lost her mind to senility. They immediately filed the emergency injunction that evening. They anticipated an easy victory, expecting the county inspectors to arrive, see the massive piles of waste, and condemn the property on the spot. What they didn't realize was that the law is a double-edged sword, and Margaret had spent 13 years studying every single line of the state's agricultural and environmental codes. The following Monday morning, the peaceful silence of the valley was broken by a caravan of vehicles. 3 local news vans, 2 state Environmental Protection Agency trucks, the county sheriff, and Richard Vance, himself in a tailored charcoal suit, arrived at the gates of the Miller farm. Vance had brought the media along intentionally. He wanted a public display of corporate environmental responsibility, showing the world that Oakridge Timber was cleaning up a hazardous property. The cameras were rolling as Vance walked up to Margaret, who was standing at the perimeter of her north pasture, right where the massive 13-year accumulation of sawdust met the corporate fence. Mrs. Miller, Vance said, turning slightly, so the camera could capture his best angle. It is a tragedy that this property has fallen into such extreme environmental decay. Under County Code 402, this accumulation of combustible biomass represents a clear and present danger to the community. We are here with the state regulators to assess the damage and take control of the remediation process. The state environmental inspector, a serious man named Dr. Harris, stepped forward with a specialized digital soil probe and a stainless steel sampling auger. He looked at Margaret with a mixture of sympathy and duty. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have to take deep core samples of the land. If the carbon levels are as dangerously high as the factory's data suggests, we will have to declare this an unviable zone. Margaret simply nodded, stepping back to let them pass. Please, she said, gesturing to the massive, dark rolling mounds behind her. Dig as deep as you like. In fact, I insist you go all the way to the bedrock. Dr. Harris walked over to the first massive dune, but as he got closer, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He stopped. He wasn't looking at dry, white, blowing sawdust anymore. The surface of the mounds wasn't pale yellow. It was a rich, dark, almost obsidian black. It looked deep, heavy, and moist. He knelt down, plunging his gloved hand into the side of the mound. Instead of dry, coarse wood particles that would blow away in the wind, his fingers sank into a dense, cool, crumbly material that smelled intensely of sweet rain, ancient forests, and rich, vibrant life. The inspector's eyes widened. He quickly grabbed his mechanical auger, driving it 6 feet deep into the center of the massive mound. He pulled the core sample out, and the news cameras zoomed in close. The material inside the tube was uniform from top to bottom. It was a magnificent, flawless, dark chocolate-colored loam. It was absolutely teeming with life. Thousands of massive, healthy earthworms were writhing through the sample, and a fine, delicate web of white mycelium network laced through the entire core. "What is this?" Vance snapped, stepping forward, his confidence suddenly faltering. "That's supposed to be raw industrial waste." "It's a fire hazard, Doctor." Aris ignored him, quickly dropping a portion of the core sample into a digital testing kit. He watched the screen as the numbers calibrated, his jaw slowly dropping open in utter disbelief. He looked at the screen, then at Margaret, then back at the screen. This isn't waste, Doctor," Aris whispered, his voice trembling slightly, perfectly picked up by the news microphones. "This is premium grade, highly concentrated, fully stabilized organic vermicompost and humus. The nitrogen-to-carbon ratio is mathematically perfect. The microbial activity density is off the charts. Mr. Vance, this isn't a hazardous dump site. This is quite literally the most fertile, biologically active soil I have ever tested in my entire 25-year career." A dead silence fell over the entire crowd. The camera crews scrambled to get shots of the rich, dark earth. Margaret stood completely still, her hands folded neatly over her cane. The trap had just snapped shut. For 13 years, the factory had delivered thousands of tons of pure carbon directly to her. And for 13 years, using her knowledge of biochemistry, she had introduced specific enzymes, moisture controls, and microbial agents to turn their malicious harassment into a literal goldmine of premium organic fertilizer. Richard Vance's face turned an ash-gray color as he stared at the digital readout. "I don't care what the dirt looks like," he yelled, losing his corporate composure completely in front of the live television cameras. "It's still our material. We dumped it here. It's our property, and she's occupying our expansion zone. Sheriff, remove her." "Actually, Mr. Vance," Margaret said, her voice cutting through his panicked, shouting like a razor blade through silk. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a thick, legally sealed document, handing it directly to the county sheriff and the state regulators. "You might want to review the State Agricultural Reclamation Act of 2014. Under Section 12, any industrial byproduct abandoned on agricultural land for a continuous period exceeding 10 years without a formal removal contract is legally classified as abandoned mineral and organic topsoil infrastructure. By law, it completely belongs to the landowner." She stepped closer to Vance, her eyes burning with a triumphant, brilliant fire. "For 13 years, your company illegally dumped your raw materials onto my property to avoid paying hazardous waste disposal fees at the state landfill. You thought you were breaking me, but you were actually supplying me with the raw materials I needed. I have spent 13 years processing your waste. Yesterday, I received the official federal certification. This property is now registered as the largest certified organic biofertilizer reserve in the eastern United States." The state inspector looked up from the documents, a massive smile breaking across his face. "She's entirely correct, Mr. Vance. The paperwork is flawless. Not only does this soil belong exclusively to Mrs. Miller, but according to the EPA regulations regarding certified organic zones, you are now in catastrophic violation." Vance stumbled backward, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Aris pointed toward the massive chain-link fence separating the factory from the farm. "Because this is now a legally protected, certified organic agricultural reserve. Federal law dictates a mandatory 1-mile environmental buffer zone from any heavy industrial pollutant emissions. Your factory's active processing lines are less than 50 feet from her new soil line. The inspector turned to the sheriff. We are issuing an immediate emergency cease and desist order to Oakridge Timber Corp. You must shut down all manufacturing operations within 2 hours, pending a full federal environmental impact review. The crowd erupted into chaotic murmurs as the news reporters frantically began broadcasting the story live to the nation. The factory that had bullied, poisoned, and terrorized a lonely widow for 13 years was being forced to completely turn off its machines in a matter of hours. The financial loss would be staggering. Millions of dollars a day, leading to inevitable corporate bankruptcy. Margaret looked out over her beautiful, dark, rich land, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over her. She could almost feel Thomas's hand resting gently on her shoulder, whispering that they had finally won. The very waste that was meant to destroy her home had become the exact tool she used to save it, turning a corporate giant's arrogance into the ultimate instrument of their own destruction. If this story of patience, brilliant, poetic justice, and the ultimate triumph of a quiet widow against an arrogant corporate giant moved your heart today, please take a brief moment to show your support. Hit that like button right now. Share this incredible story with your friends and family to spread the power of justice. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring, deep cinematic journey. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next story.